When the Night Comes Out presents The Hive, Part 13. Warden Michael Kettinger's log. Hello, yes, this is Warden Kettinger. I have no idea what the date and time are. Things have gone, quite literally, to hell. I'm actually just recording this on the phone that they gave us when we came down here. Weird, because they don't work anywhere else but here in the Hive. Sorry, getting distracted. Yeah, so the entire Hive is under a lockdown, and the entire world could be in jeopardy. Something that reanimates dead people and turns them into sharp-toothed, drooling, wall-crawling creatures that eat people and turn other people into them has been awakened. We have sealed off the part of the mine where we think it all started. Yeah, and we sealed it off, but really it was Dalton King. Jesus Christ, I'm all over the place here. I'm working with Dalton King to try and stop these things from killing everyone currently living and working in the Hive. Right now, as I understand it, they're attacking the administration building. If they take that, they will go after the gate. If they get through that, then all of Hive City is waiting for them, and there will be almost nothing to stop them. Once they have that, then it's on to the lift and the surface. This recording is probably not even going anywhere, but if I die, I want there to be a record. The prisoners have joined us and are fighting beside us. I had to bring Dalton King into this because he's the only one with the skills to destroy these creatures. He set up the explosives to seal off the new tunnel in the mine. Now he's got an assembly line of us guards making flamethrowers and bombs. Yeah, you heard that right. Flamethrowers and bombs. If these things get to the surface, there may be nothing that can stop them. No one up there has seen anything like these before, outside of movies. We have to do whatever we can to keep them down here, even if that means we have to bring the entire Hive down on top of us. I know how we can do it, too. There is a contingency plan. There are explosives set all over this place as a last resort. I am the one person who can set off the destruct signal. All of us in the Hive prison and Hive City will be buried under thousands of tons of rock. Anyway, I have to get back to the assembly lines. I have to get back to making weapons with the most dangerous man on the planet. I hope we don't have to go so far as to bring this place down, but we will. I will. God help us. Hell, Satan help us. At this point, I'll take the help anywhere I can. My assistant Jen is taking the lead back at the administration building right now. I hope to God she's still alive by the time we get there. They came through the hole in the wall like a living wave, save for the fact that none of them were living, of course. Jen had to push back the sense of nausea and fear that covered her the moment she saw all of the gnashing teeth and horrendous claws. Something resembling saliva dripped from their fangs as they ran, but they did not seem to move like thinking things. They ran as one giant group, just making for the first living creatures they saw. Jen took careful aim and fired. Then the air was filled with the sounds of others firing too. One by one, the first wave of them fell with shots to the head. They swarmed like mice or rats, some of them climbing up the walls and then scurrying across the ceiling. Eventually, some of the guards joined the firing line with their rifles and their scopes at the ready. One by one, they aimed and took their shots, and the bodies of the creatures began to pile up, creating another barrier between the humans and whatever these creatures were. Jen ran out of ammo, and the empty mag dropped to the floor. She reloaded fast and fired again. It was a smooth process now, the memories of her training on the firing range coming back to her. She held the gun in both hands and aimed carefully. Ignore the creatures above and around her. Just focus on the ones right in her sights. Then fire and take one shot to down one creature. The rate of fire was blistering and all around her. The creatures were bunched up in the doorway, but still they climbed the face of the administration building and poured into the windows. It would not be long before they would overwhelm them. Someone off to Jen's right screamed a high-pitched scream that got louder and louder before it was cut off. It was impossible to tell if it was male or female. Then another scream off to the left. The creatures were catching on. More of them exited the office by climbing up the walls and onto the ceiling. They dropped down all around her, sometimes on the floor, but more often than not on someone. A few Jen saw were bitten, but more than a few were being torn to pieces. "Get back to the break room," Jen cried out. Jen ran, hating the fact she turned her back on these creatures. She saw the guards who had taken up sniper posts behind the tables and other barriers that blocked the break room. The bullets flew over her head. She ducked instinctively, but kept her eyes on the prize. She could feel the creatures coming up behind her. All around her, they snarled and grabbed people. There were screams that turned into hideous gurgles as their throats were ripped out, and sometimes the screams just faded as whomever was grabbed dragged them off to turn them into one of their own. She reached the barrier in the doorway and leapt into the air, going back to her days running track, and the guards who were there parted as she did so. She landed on the other side of the barrier, and then her feet slid, and she ended up on the floor. Behind her, the guns roared. More people made their way into the break area, helped over by the guards. Jen got to her feet, her own gun held up, ready for action, but the world felt like it tilted slightly on its axis. She staggered against the wall as she saw more of the people she worked with staggering over the barriers and into the room, all of them taking up positions around the break room with their guns ready. There was blood running from their foreheads and other body parts. Nothing felt real. Jen had a moment where she was sure she was going to faint or throw up first and then faint. "Are you okay, Jen?" asked a woman to her left. Margaret, Jen reminded herself. She was another assistant for one of the other managers. She could not remember the manager's name. "Yes, just a little faint," she replied. "I know, this is insane. I can't believe this is happening." The roar of the guns became constant. From where she stood, Jen could see the creatures trying to get into the break room, which was now filled with so many, but not nearly as many as Jen had hoped. Where had the rest of the workers gone? Had they all been killed or turned? As if to answer her question, she saw a man named David, who was an accountant, attack one of the guards at the barrier, his face bloody and his teeth long and sharp. Jen raised her pistol and put a bullet right through David's forehead, and he fell backwards into the office. "Margaret, they're going to figure out that there's an open door behind us here. We need to start moving people out of the break room and down to some of the other floors. These creatures are all climbing up, so we need to start heading down. Plus, we need to be able to open the doors and let Mike and Dalton and the rest in when they get here." Margaret nodded and started talking to the employees who were near the back of the break room. They began to exit through the other doorway and head for the stairs. Jen ran up to the guards who were firing and firing, then reloading as fast as they could. "We're going to move them out the back and down the stairs," Jen said to the guard on her right. "Keep them occupied and off of us. How are you doing on ammo?" "We've got enough. Get going. We'll hold them off as long as we can." Jen turned and ran, the sounds of the gunfire and the snarling, gnashing, biting creatures in her ears as she stepped into the hallway. Up ahead were the stairs and the rest of the building to try and stop these things. Kettinger stood in the assembly line attaching the various supplies Dalton had grabbed from the medical ward and then from the locker and equipment rooms within the mines. So far, they had several primitive-looking creations that worked like flamethrowers and a bunch of small metal tanks which could easily be turned into bombs. All of them, the guards and King, worked as fast as they could. The problem was everything they were working with could potentially explode in a fireball. Needless to say, this meant they needed lots of deep concentration and focus. "How many of these do we need?" Reg asked. "We need enough to take on about 1,000 of those creatures, and potentially more of them if they are currently turning half of the office workers in the administration building into creatures like themselves," Dalton King said while working away and not spending even a moment looking up from his work. "I hate to be harsh here, gentlemen, but we have to consider the fact the entire building could be overrun. Our main goal is to get as many of these finished as we can and cut them off from entering Hive City." Kettinger kept working, but despite the fact his hands were working feverishly and he was assembling weapons, he felt like he was standing still. There had been no communication from Jen or anyone else, and he was sure all of his people, his friends, those he saw day after day, were fighting for their lives. He bit his tongue and chewed on his lower lip. Then he grabbed the next component and began assembling more weapons. There was nothing more he could do than that, and say prayers to a god he was fairly sure was either not there, or they were too far down for him to care. Carl stood in his little booth and cleared his throat. His hands were shaking. He had been here, in this little booth, as the man everyone saw when they went through the gate for years now, and had never had to fire a weapon. Now, here he was in a bulletproof vest and with a rifle beside him and a pistol in his hands. Of course, he had heard the radio chatter. He knew that there were things attacking the administration building. He was not an idiot, despite his aw shucks attitude. He knew what was going on around him. There were creatures that were animating the dead, turning other people into creatures, and they had sharp teeth and tore people to pieces. He cast a glance behind him, and he could see the rest of Hive City. About half an hour ago, the entire population back in the city had moved into the school, which was about as far away from the gate as anyone could get. It was hardly a fortress, but in the weird silence which had fallen over the city, he could still hear hammering and power tools from the direction of the school. Everyone was doing as much as they could to turn that place into a fortress. What the hell was he going to do? "I am not cut out for this," he whispered. "I am not cut out for this." Carl was a man in his mid-40s, and he was the first to admit he had more than a bit of gut around the middle. Every year he had to pass a test with the guns, and his accuracy against paper targets was excellent. But as for these jumping, scampering things he was hearing about over the radio, he had no idea how he was going to be able to do anything. "I'm not ready for this," he whispered, chewing on his lower lip. "Jesus Christ, what's going on here?" There was a loud sound from behind the gate. It had to have been a huge explosion or something for it to make it through the thick metal door. During his entire time in the hive, he had only opened the giant door once. It was to allow some construction equipment to get through and down to the mines. Mostly, everyone came in through the smaller door built into the gate. It was large enough for big groups to get through, and even the golf carts most people drove around here. Carl fingered the butt of his pistol nervously. There was another sound from the other side of the metal door. Were there things already there, trying to get through? He knelt down until he was just peeking over the edge of the window built into this little building. He switched over to the rifle and sighted the door within the gate. If something came through, he hoped he could knock it down before it got more than a few inches inside. All of those people down there needed him. All of the children and the wives and the people who worked and made Hive City needed him. "Jesus, let me shoot straight," he said. Jen managed to get to the floor below and to the front of the line of workers all running ahead of her. Already on the floor below, they had piled furniture near the staircase entrance, and there were people with guns ready to start blasting. Is this what we're really going to do? She thought to herself. Are we just going to run from floor to floor and hope to whittle them down? How many are we going to lose along the way? There has to be something better. There was little time to think, because the gunfire coming down the stairs was so loud it was deafening, echoing off the walls and the stairwell. She ran for the barrier, and someone helped her over it. Behind her, more office workers from upstairs came through the door in a panic, their eyes wide in fear. Some of them appeared to be bleeding. Think, she thought. Think of what to do. This cannot go on. More office workers came stumbling out in a rush, and suddenly one of the creatures exploded out of the door to the stairwell and landed on the back of Randy, one of the office workers. His eyes went wide with terror, and the creature leaned down and bit his shoulder, tearing out meat, and the sound of breaking bones filled the air. Randy screamed, but it was far too late, and 3 more of the creatures came through the door and piled on. The gunfire erupted right after Randy was buried in the demonic things. However, everyone was frightened and they were moving, so there were no headshots. One of the creatures seemed almost casual and reached out with one hand and grabbed a blonde-haired woman and bit her on the forearm, then let her go. This woman shouted and grabbed her arm. Blood poured between her fingers. She looked up toward the barrier, her eyes pleading for help, but it only took seconds, and she staggered to her left, collided with the wall. "Help me," she said, but her voice was barely above a whisper. Jen watched as the strength left her legs and she sank to the floor. Her eyes clouded and her head slumped. Then, just a fraction of a second later, her head snapped up and her mouth opened. Somehow, some way, her teeth were all points now. Instead of a voice, some gargled growl came out of her throat. She leapt to her feet and turned toward the barrier with hunger. Jen lifted her pistol, aimed, and fired a bullet through this woman's forehead, and she went down face first. The creatures were now piled in the doorway, but they were climbing up the walls and scurrying across the ceiling. It was like trying to shoot a huge group of ants, scattering everywhere, moving so fast it was almost impossible to see them. The gym, Jen thought. If we can herd them into the gym, get the people out, and put these things in there, we can lock the doors. Containment. Just contain them and wait for Mike and Dalton and Reg to get back. Already, the creatures had killed 4 more and turned 6 more into creatures like them. "Lead them down!" Jen cried. "Someone, give me a radio!" A radio was slapped into her hands, and she pressed the button. "Clear out the gym. We're leading them down. All of them." She handed the radio back, not even waiting for acknowledgement. "Get to the other set of stairs and head down," Jen commanded. "We're leading them to the gym." Everyone began to run, and the creatures poured out of the stairwell doorway. As Jen ran, she heard them knocking over chairs and cubicles, shattered glass, and snarling and growling. You've been listening to When the Night Comes Out, The Hive. Tune in next time for The Hive, Part 14. Written by Brian W. Alaspa. Narrated and produced by Ali James. Music by Vivek Abhishek. Catch up on the first 4 seasons of When the Night Comes Out now. Support us on Patreon for more terrifying content.